and everything all at once. Perfect. And it looks like the recording has started as well. So again, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Joanna Graham, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on MBA letters of recommendation. So as I mentioned, I've been working in this space for about 20 years, really excited to chat with you all a little bit more about one very key element of the application, and one often that is, I think, really overlooked. A lot of folks, sort of think this is the one piece of the application. I don't want to say that they can overlook or they can breathe a little more easily around, but it's certainly one where it doesn't feel like you have to do quite as much heavy lifting. And so I do want to talk about what letter of recommendation, sort of how the letter of recommendation factors into your application holistically, and then do a much deeper dive into common questions folks have about who you should be asking, but probably more importantly, really the heavy lifting part that I think a lot of folks sometimes overlook, and that is how does the letter of recommendation really roll up into the larger B-School application? Great. So just a little bit of an intro here. So as I mentioned, Target Test Prep it really is sort of your one-stop shop for the entire admissions journey when it comes to graduate management education. So as you can see, I think most folks, and I saw a lot of folks mentioning that you're studying for the GMAT or the GRE currently. So I'm guessing that you're probably using TTP study materials. But if not, and if this is something that's on your radar, do know that the TTP does offer a variety of different test prep services, and really has services designed to meet the needs of every single applicant. So whether it's a self-study course, if you prefer something that's a bit more self-paced, or if you find that you learn a bit better in a group setting and want to sign up for a scheduled live class, or for folks maybe who have very specific needs, that one-on-one tutoring can be a great resource, especially to help you get over the finish line. But there are a variety of different resources available to folks, and so I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to check those out. And then with regards to admissions consulting, this is a newer service, admittedly, that TTP has been offering. We launched last fall, but as I mentioned at the beginning, while admissions consulting is new to TTP, this is not a space that is new for me personally. I've been working in this space for over 20 years and have worked, in that time, have worked with over 500 applicants on successful applications to business school. Very much like prep, you can see there really are a variety of different options when it comes to admissions consulting for TTP. Like many firms, we do offer a very traditional school package, which includes everything sort of from soup to nuts in your application. We do offer a la carte hourly, as well as truly a la carte services. If you're looking just to have one final review of your application or work specifically on resume, you can take a look at all the different services that we do offer. Okay, so a rough agenda, excuse me, a rough agenda for today. So we're going to start very much like I do a lot of admissions webinars with sort of a 35,000 foot view. I think it's really important when you are thinking about your MBA application or specialized master's, because this certainly applies to that as well. So anything really into the GME space. It really is important to do a bit of an overview of sort of what holistic admissions means. What types of things are admissions committees looking at? How are they evaluating you? And how do things sort of roll up into the larger admissions picture? We'll talk obviously about why everyone is here, and that is the role of letters of rec. We'll do a deep dive into sort of how you should be picking your recommenders, and probably more importantly here, sort of providing guidance to recommenders. So we'll talk in great detail about a matrix that I use with a lot of my clients to help really think through what types of things you want your recommenders to focus on and how to set up that guidance. And then we'll spend some time troubleshooting. So I think there are a variety of different special circumstances, unique circumstances that folks will run into. And so based on what I've sort of seen over my experience in this space, I've put together a short list of some of the more sort of common circumstances, but we'll certainly open it up at the end for questions, and certainly happy to answer and address any questions that folks might have specifically. And then lastly, we will start talking a little bit more about sort of do's and don'ts. So what are the things that you should be thinking about? What are the things that you should not be doing when it comes to letters of rec? And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll open up for Q&A, probably the last 15 minutes or so. Wonderful. So let's get started and talk a little bit about holistic admissions. So holistic admissions is really just a fancy way of saying that schools are going to be looking at you comprehensively or holistically. They're looking at applicants from a variety of different perspectives, but what they really are trying to do is get a sense of sort of the whole picture. So there isn't just one piece of your application that is what I would call sort of a make or break. There are pieces that, maybe weighed a bit more heavily than others, but holistically, schools are really going to be looking at trying to build a very three-dimensional idea of who you are as a person, what your professional experience has been. And that is really at the top of the list here, because for so many MBA programs, as you probably have seen, the value that you're going to get out of the program really is going to be contingent on the quality of experience that you have going into the program. What types of things are you going to be able to contribute to classroom discussions? How are you going to be able to engage with your peers? Are you going to have a frame of reference for common business challenges, for example? On the heels of that, very closely are academics. And so this really means, what types of courses did you take as an undergrad? What was that undergraduate GPA? Have you challenged yourself both as an undergrad, but also once you graduated? Have you continued to demonstrate an interest in learning and in bettering your skills, bettering your experiences, and really trying to show that you are interested in adding those additional skills and experiences? So academics is the big piece of it. We can certainly talk obviously about the role that undergrad GPA plays in it. For many folks may choose to pursue a master's before they go to business school. And so in that case, undergraduate GPA as well as that grad school GPA or that master's GPA is going to be looked at as well. And for folks, who maybe have some blemishes, because we were all we were all teens and young adults at some point, and sometimes your undergrad experience might not necessarily be representative or indicative of the person you are now. I think it's certainly good to think about, what other types of coursework or what other things have you been able to accomplish that really can sort of show a school that you have the capacity to be successful in the classroom. Next are test scores. And so in this case, we're talking about the GMAT, and I am being very specific when I say the GMAT as opposed to the GMAT focus. I believe as of yesterday, focus has been dropped. So we are essentially talking about the same test. So the GMAT, the GRE, and the executive assessment. Schools are going to look at those scores to give them an indication of, number one, how you stack up against your competition, but really number two, do you have the potential to do well in the classroom? I think the GMAT in particular, given that was a product that I worked so closely on for a decade, and can sort of speak to that a little bit more closely. But I think specifically with the GMAT, schools really try to look at the GMAT to see, or as an indicator of how you'll perform, particularly when it comes to quant and the rigor of a first year MBA program. I will mention about test scores. One other word about test scores is that this is the one piece of your application that you do have a bit of control over, because it is it's a more recent data point. So for anyone who is struggling potentially with a lower or a less than ideal undergraduate GPA, a high test score is certainly something that can help you sort of mitigate against that or dispel any sort of fears or concerns that a school might have about your quantitative capacity. So this is a great thing to think about as you are thinking about testing. And a word, I guess, just about test options. There are many schools that offer waivers or that are test optional these days. I would encourage you, if you are thinking about this and weighing your options, to really think about if you do aggressively pursue the test waiver, are there enough sort of objective metrics and other data points in your application to make sure that schools do have a very good sense of how you will perform in the classroom, particularly when it comes to quant in that first year. Letters of recommendation, obviously that's what we're here to talk about today, so I won't spend too much time here. But this, obviously is a good chance for schools to get a sense of, how are you perceived by others who are working with you, and really get a sense of sort of some of that additional perspective. When it comes to extracurricular activities and community service, this is going to be incredibly important as well. So extracurricular activities give schools a sense of what type of community member are you going to be? So how are you going to engage and really immerse yourself in the school community when you join? Are you going to be that student who shows up and goes to class, goes to the library, checks in, checks out? Or are you going to be someone who really gets involved with community programs, clubs, activities? Schools want to see, are you willing and are you interested in leaving that community better than you found it? And what type of person are you going to be contributing to that overall sort of school culture and mission? And that aligns nicely with that next point there, this is alignment with schools' mission and values. I'm sure that as you've been researching programs, a lot of these schools start to sound very similar. Everyone talks about being great, in accounting, or really having a strong quant program, or really focusing on leadership. It can sometimes be challenging to sort of distill through that what a school actually is looking for, what a school sort of stands for. And so something I do suggest to folks is, as you are looking at schools, you are looking at, what are they good at, or what do they claim to be good at? The first thing I always tell clients is to go take a look at their website and take a look specifically at the page where schools talk about what their mission is and what are the values that the university stands for. And you'll find a lot that can be tucked into those mission statements. And that really gives you an indication of what are the things that a school is going to value above all else. And so that, again, that'll give you some clues and some ideas on maybe how to sort of lean into different things within certain parts of your application. But that's really what they're looking for when they read your application is, are you aligned? Do they feel like you're someone who is consistent and is going to really embrace the culture of that institution? This next one I know can sometimes, this word can be a little bit controversial. This idea of brand can sometimes be tough because, brands are, I think when most people think about brands, they're thinking about it from a marketing perspective, and they really are thinking about sort of how something, the image that you conjure up when you think of something, and then sort of manipulating that or tweaking that depending on what the school is looking for. And I always am really quick to point out that having a personal brand or thinking about how you want to talk about, a brand or a profile isn't necessarily asking you to be something that you're not. It's really thinking about what is the distinct perspective or point of view that you're bringing to the table. When you think about brands, and I don't want to get into too much of an exercise on this, but I always encourage folks to think a little bit about brands from a perspective of, as an individual, expertise, purpose, and authenticity. And so as you think about your own background and your own profile, expertise really is, what are you good at? And as you might imagine, there's no shortage of finance folks or management consultants who are applying to business school. And so if that is your expertise, it's really hard to stand out if that's sort of what you're building a profile on. And so purpose and authenticity then are the things that you start to layer on top of that to really start thinking about, how do I now start to separate myself out from my competition? So in the case of purpose, what are the things that get you out of bed in the morning? So maybe you are a whiz at finance. Maybe you are, a ninja when it comes to Google Sheets or spreadsheets. But is that something that really drives you or gets you out of bed in the morning and gets the juices flowing? And it very well may be. But I find that for most folks, there are usually other things that really drive them. And that's going to more often than not, be aligned with extracurricular activities, community service, and also with future aspirational plans beyond business school. And so I would encourage you to think about that in addition to this idea of authenticity. So what are the things that make you uniquely you? And then as you start thinking about all three of those things in conjunction, that really is sort of the foundation for thinking about what is that distinct perspective or point of view that you're bringing to your application. Next up are soft skills. We love them. We talk about them in some ways. Sometimes I think they can be a little bit, it's a bit of overkill when we talk about soft skills. But at the end of the day, this is something that schools are really going to be looking at closely. They're trying to figure out, are you a lifelong learner? Do you enjoy learning? Are you intellectually curious? Leadership is obviously huge here. How have you demonstrated leadership in your professional life, in your personal life? Do you have potential for leadership? And then I think these last two, this idea of grit and resilience, are huge because you really want to be thinking about, as you encounter hardships or as you encounter challenges, how do you face those? Because for many, business school is incredibly challenging, and you're going to be pushed in ways you haven't been professionally. And so schools want to see, how are you going to measure up? How are you going to sort of rise to that occasion? And then last but not least, interviews. So for some schools, they are by invitation only. For others, they are a part of the process. But regardless, the interview is a chance for you to be able to breathe a little more life into your application, into your essays, into your stories, and really sort of give schools an additional point of view and perspective here. And so in total, as you can see, this really is sort of what makes up the admissions committee's job here in terms of evaluating candidates on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so let's start diving now into actually what we're here to talk about today, and that is the role of the letters of rec. So the letter of recommendation is going to vary a little bit school by school, but for the most part, it really is designed to give schools a third party perspective or point of view on your skills, business skills, soft skills, sort of technical skills, as well as your goals. And more importantly, your potential. And so this is an opportunity for someone who's not you, who is not going to be incredibly biased, to really be able to talk about what is the impact you have had at your workplace, or potentially in an organization maybe that you volunteered at. It really is designed to give schools some additional context on things that you have done. In many cases, this is going to help the admissions committee determine if you are a good fit, both at the school and the institution level, but also at the program level. These, the letters, as you'll see, are designed to evaluate you on a variety of different skills, but also really talk about sort of what you've been able to contribute in the workplace. And so this is a great opportunity, again, for admissions officers to really get a sense of, is this going to be someone who we feel is going to be a good fit in our program? In many cases, the letters will either validate or build on things that you start talking about in your essays and experiences that you've shared. And more importantly, this is also a great place to provide new information or additional context. So, and when we talk about sort of guidance for your letter writers, we'll get into this in much greater detail, but letters of rec are a great place to, as you're planning and sort of thinking about the stories that you want to tell in your application, if you do run out of space, which everyone does, this can also be a great place for you to provide additional information or context for folks who, that are for the folks reading your application that otherwise wouldn't be included in your application. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you go about picking your recommenders. So one of the things that that folks always ask is, what are the things that I need to be thinking about? Is it better to ask someone with who at the C-suite title, or is it better to ask someone I've known for 10 years? Is it better to ask someone I've worked with, or someone who taught me in school who knows me really well? So the first thing to really think about just are these considerations. So we'll tackle professional versus academic first. Typically, business schools want to see professional recommendations. They want to understand or hear sort of more about the person you are in the workplace. And so the things that you've been able to accomplish, the impact you've been able to drive, these are more likely than not going to be things that have happened much more recently as well. And so the professional recommendation is really going to speak to those business skills, whereas academic can often be a little bit challenging because you are talking about things that happened while you were an undergrad. And so unless you are applying to a deferred entry program, so a 2+2 program, for example, or if you have minimal work experience, and by minimal, I mean probably fewer than 3 years, I really would urge you to consider trying to lean into asking professional contacts for letters of recommendation. There obviously are some exceptions to that, and we can certainly talk a little bit more about that, down the road and further during Q&A. But when it comes to professional versus academic, if you are applying to a full-time program and have at least a couple of years of work experience, schools tend to want to see letters from people who know you in a professional capacity. The next thing to think about here is what we call sort of like the quality of the length of your relationship versus the title. And so again, I'm sure everyone wonders, it's got to be nice to have a letter of rec from someone who's maybe the chief financial officer, the chief marketing officer, as opposed to maybe someone who's a director or a VP. But I will tell you what schools are really looking for in these letters. They're looking to really understand who you are as a person. They're looking for personal stories and examples. If both of those coincide, then obviously go with someone who obviously has a bit more experience and is going to be able to speak to you and your experiences in a broader context. But I do really encourage folks to think about who is going to be able to tell the best stories about what you've been able to do in the workplace. And so again, the quality of that relationship is going to be huge. And the length of the relationship can be important. I mean, I think especially for many folks who work in a field like consulting, where you may be rotating on and off of projects on a more frequent basis, it sometimes can be a little bit challenging if you're trying to think through who is going to be able to speak to your impact best. But I would encourage you again to think about the quality here. So if you think about the story that someone's going to tell, if it is someone maybe who doesn't know you as well, they might say some very nice things about you, but they're probably going to be fairly general and fairly broad. So-and-so is a great worker. They're very diligent. They are in the office 5 days a week. But a supervisor is going to really be able to give an example of how you show up for your colleagues. How are you a great team player? How do you, lean into building relationships and communicating well, and give those specific examples. So again, I would really encourage you to think about who is going to be able to speak to those things best. The next thing that I encourage folks to do is, before you ever ask anyone, is to start building a matrix of skills and experiences. And like I said, we'll go into this in a little more detail in just a few slides. But the matrix is designed to make sure that you're not having redundancies basically in your letters. And so the idea here is, if you pick a handful of, let's say, 10 different soft skills, and some technical skills and experiences that you want to have included in your letters of rec, then go through and start matching that against people that you're considering. So I encourage folks, on the sort of on the vertical list to have all of this different skills. So maybe it's leadership, maybe it's communication, maybe it could be a variety of different things. And then across the horizontal axis, have the names of 3 to 5 individuals that you're considering, and then start populating that matrix to get a sense of who's going to be able to speak to different skills. First off, it's just a yes or no question. But then on the second pass through, I really encourage folks to go through and think about how are the stories that they tell going to be high quality stories? How good are those examples going to be? And then think about the depth and the richness of that relationship. And if you have folks who can speak to multiple things, fantastic. But at the end of the day, you want to take a look and make sure that you have good, diverse coverage over all of those skills, and that you're asking folks who aren't going to necessarily be talking about, number one, the same stories and experiences, but number two, aren't necessarily going to be talking about the exact same sets of skills. You want to make sure that you really are casting a wide net so that the admissions committee is going to really get to understand you and multiple values and attributes that you're going to bring to the table. Lastly, I would encourage you to see if the schools that you're applying to are using the common letter of recommendation template. And this is something that is offered through GMAT. And this is a newer resource. For anyone who applied to schools, to undergrad programs as an undergrad, think of it very similarly to the Common App, where it is a template that many schools have signed on to basically use this for letters of rec. And so schools like Dartmouth, Georgetown, NYU, Duke, Cornell, Yale, Stanford all use this. And it really is a way to streamline the process, because as you'll see, while many letters of recommendation, the templates are similar and they're asking similar things, you can, once you start getting into the weeds and the minutiae, you can start having to then ask letter writers to really come up with multiple versions and drafts of these letters. And so checking to see if any of these schools use the common letter rec template is going to be helpful to sort of streamline the process, especially when you make that ask. So you've asked your letter writers and now they've said yes, and now you're thinking about, what do I actually need to tell them? So after you ask, so number one, you want to make sure that you are providing sufficient lead time. So it is so important to make sure that your letter writers know that you are planning on applying either during round 1 or round 2, and what that actually means. So make sure that they have a clear list of, these are the schools, these are the deadlines, this is sort of the drop dead date by when my letter needs to be submitted. It's also really important to be clear about the letter of recommendation format and the expectations. And so many folks might just assume they can write a letter and then just PDF it and send it off. Very similar to letters of rec, maybe for undergrad. But for many business schools, you have very specific forms. There are very specific sort of questionnaires that are being shared that folks need to fill out, in addition to answering some free response questions. And so while many folks, the inclination might be just to write a one-page letter, it is really important to make sure that you are giving your letter writers a very clear list. And so again, I always encourage folks to put this all into a spreadsheet, so that way they know exactly what are the due dates, links maybe to the requirements, and then actually copying and pasting all of the different questions. So that way it's very, very clear not only what the expectations are of the letter writer, but also what some of the rules and guidelines are, especially around the word count. And then finally, sharing this idea of a one-pager, or really, frankly, a two-pager more often than not, with very concrete examples and a copy of an updated resume. And I think that that's important, because especially if you're having someone who maybe is supervising you currently, but doesn't know maybe as much about sort of your professional path and where you've been, it's great to sort of show that growth. Or if you're asking someone who's a former supervisor, for example, it might be good for them to see where you are currently and how you've grown since you've left that organization. And then last but not least, I always encourage folks to make sure that you do include areas of growth or potential and other weaknesses. It is something that is asked in many of these letters. And this isn't one of those softball sort of type questions where you can say that, your area of growth is that you are a perfectionist or that you take on too much. It really is something where you want to have concrete feedback. And more often than not, the question is framed more as, what is a piece of constructive feedback you have given this person? And so it is good, the folks writing your letters may have clear ideas, but it is really good, I think, for you to tee up some other ideas as well. That way you can help, in theory, not control the narrative, but at least help influence it a bit. All right, so let's start diving into some of the sort of idea of this skills and experience matrix. So here you have a list of all of the skills that are asked, that are basically asked on the Harvard Business School letter of recommendation questionnaire or form. And so the letter writers are asked to evaluate candidates on these three buckets. So being business minded, leadership focused, and growth oriented. And as you can see here, it's a variety of different soft skills, but you also do have sort of some very broad buckets here of more technical skills too. So when you think about quantitative skills here, verbal communication, written communication, they really are being asked, how do you essentially stack up or measure up against your peers? These other areas here around leadership and growth, as you can see, are going to factor in incredibly closely as well. I think with regards to leadership, there's certainly going to be things that some people may not be able to judge everyone on, and that is certainly an option. But I think it is really important as much as possible to be able to ensure that you are picking people who are going to have something meaningful to say about all of these skills. This is also a great list to start using to populate that matrix that I mentioned a few slides before. So as you're thinking about your letter writers, knowing that these are skills that are being asked, that are being asked of on the forms, this is a great place to start as you think about who could talk about my integrity, or who could talk, for example, about my ability to collaborate with a team or lead and mentor others. And again, as I mentioned before, this can also be something. This is also something that you could certainly. That certainly some folks are going to be able to lean into a little bit more heavily than others. So I do encourage folks to, again, do that initial pass through and just kind of get a sense of, what are the things that people are going to be able to talk about. And then on that second one, actually think a little bit more about depth. Who's going to have better stories? And you can start ranking those. And so I encourage folks to oftentimes come up with a little bit of a weighting system or a color coding system. So that way it's obvious in the matrix which individuals are going to have more things to say when it comes to different areas. The open questions. So again, now these are the questions that appear on the Harvard Business School letter of recommendation form. These are also going to be questions that tend to appear on the common letter of recommendation template and a handful of other places as well, maybe just slightly different derivatives. What I do think is interesting to point out, and as I mentioned before, especially as you think about sort of length and guidance here, there's a very big difference between 250 words and 500 words. And in the case of Harvard Business School, the first question maxes out at 300 words and the second one maxes out at 250. Whereas on the common letter of rec template, you have up to 500 words for each of these questions. Those are significant differences in terms of length. And so it is really important that as you are thinking about the guidance that you're giving folks, number one, making sure that they understand that they are more likely than not going to potentially need multiple versions of the free responses for letters of rec, but they also are going to have the opportunity, again, to be able to detail this or go into much greater detail in some of these letters of rec. And so it's important for you to also be able to try and influence that a bit in the sense of letting them know if you have to prioritize certain stories or certain things, what are the things that are more important to you, and perhaps what are things maybe that you're already covering in other parts of your application that you either would rather have validation or have someone validate separately, or perhaps have them talk about something different since you are covering that in another part of your application. All right, so let's start talking about sort of some of these sort of special circumstances. There are, and as I mentioned, there are probably an infinite number of questions we could dive into, but I wanted to kind of come up with some of the more popular ones. And probably the most common question that I receive from folks is, what if I can't ask my current manager or supervisor? And it could be for a variety of reasons. There are many folks where they don't necessarily want folks that they work with to know that they are planning on applying to business school. And that is a very valid concern. There could be repercussions when it comes to things like promotion potential, or if you are willing potentially to do another year, if you don't get into the school of your top choice, it might create some challenges if you were to stay. And so there are a variety of reasons, and this is a very, very common situation for many folks. And so I usually encourage folks to think about, number one, if you can't ask your current manager or supervisor, is there someone else in your current company you could ask? So do you have a dotted line maybe into someone else in a position of authority who you would trust or feel comfortable talking to about your business school application? And if not, then is there a peer? Is there a colleague or a team member who could maybe speak to some of these things as well? If asking someone at your current company is completely off limits, then I start to encourage folks to think a little bit more broadly. So think about this in terms of concentric circles. So if it's not someone at your company, is there maybe a client or a vendor with whom you work very closely, who again is going to be able to speak to many of these things? You could certainly ask them. And obviously, I would encourage you to to sort of use your own discretion in terms of thinking about who's going to be the best fit. But there are a lot of people with whom you probably connect with on a regular basis who are going to be able to speak to those technical skills that you just saw, those soft skills, what it's like to work with you in a variety of different capacities. And so I think one of the common misconceptions is that you have to have a current manager or supervisor, and you are at a disadvantage if you don't. But I think I will say this, more schools than not recognize that this can be a very sensitive topic. And as long as you explain who is right, who this person is, and provide some context, schools really do understand this and are quite forgiving about it. Next up, what about working for a family business, or potentially if you are an entrepreneur or a founder, for example, and so you don't necessarily have someone above you, or if you're in a family business, it can be a bit challenging to have someone who's a family member. Maybe asking an aunt or uncle or a parent to write your letter isn't necessarily going to land well with a school either. And so in cases like this, again, I encourage folks to think about, are there clients, are there vendors, are there other sort of peers or industry folks with whom you associate on a regular basis, who could speak to some of these qualities and skills that you feel comfortable at. In some cases, you could also ask, if you're an entrepreneur, you could certainly ask someone who reports into you if you have a very close working relationship, particularly if you're in a startup. Very often you're working very, very closely with folks either at your level or perhaps one level down, and who could certainly speak to all of these skills. And that sort of dovetails into that next question, is that what if my coworker or peer knows me better than my own manager? So again, I think it's, as I mentioned before, that the quality piece is going to be incredibly important. I think one of the benefits of having someone in a more senior level role, so having a manager, having someone who has managed teams or has a bit more business experience, is that they can provide much broader context. Again, they have more experience, they probably have seen much more, they've experienced much more, and they can speak to the quality and the impact of their contribution in a much more meaningful way than someone perhaps who is a bit more junior and doesn't have quite as much experience. And so again, I would ask you to consider weighing that as you start building out that matrix of potential individuals. If you're thinking about, like I said, a former supervisor, again, that could be someone, that could also be a value as well. I think it's really important, if you're talking about someone though who managed you previously, that if and when you do ask them and talk to them, that they really do understand sort of how you continue to grow and evolve in your career trajectory since leaving that organization. So that way they're not just speaking to the person you were when you work together. And obviously they don't necessarily know you as sort of in your professional capacity now, but you can at least allude to some of that, so they understand, they can plant those seeds that you are continuing to grow and evolve on a very on a rapid trajectory there. A common question, and this is something that a lot of folks don't like to talk about, is that oftentimes people can be asked to write their own letters of rec. Managers, executives can often be very busy. They don't necessarily have the time. They have very good intentions though, and so they'll just say something like, "Oh, it's fine. Just write. Just write. Like our relationship really well. Just write it out, and I'll sign it." And I really encourage folks, if this is the case, number one, if this is someone that you really want writing this letter, I do encourage you to push back and really ask them to take the time to sit down and write and complete the letter of recommendation. And if this is something that is not an option, then finding someone else to write the letter of recommendation. It is, number one, it's inappropriate, and schools do ask folks, who in fact is writing it. But I think at a larger level too, if you are writing a lot of things for your application, schools are going to be able to pick up on your writing style. And so in many cases, it can be very, very obvious if you are also contributing and writing that letter of recommendation, as opposed to having someone else actually write it for you. So again, that can be a tricky topic to broach, especially if it's someone with whom you have a very good relationship. But if it's someone you believe would write a good letter, have great things to say about you, I always encourage folks to really push back a little bit and see if there's not something that you can come up with that individual. And perhaps that's maybe giving them additional guidance or giving them much more detailed examples. Again, I think facilitating this process for folks is incredibly important, but it is important to just also equally important to make sure that you are sort of walking that fine line. What if my recommender has not submitted at the deadline? This is something that happens probably more often than folks like to think so. But again, you're incredibly busy at work. Your letter writers are probably incredibly busy at work. It is really important to make sure that, number one, going back to that first point that I made, that you give them ample time, that you give them enough lead time, and that you let them know when those deadlines are. And then if you are at deadline and your letter writer still hasn't submitted, it is really important to make sure that you then start reaching out and just nudging them. I know that some schools will reach out directly, and there'll be an email or communication that goes out to folks if they're still waiting on it. But more often than not, that's not necessarily the case. And it really is your responsibility as the person applying to make sure that you are following up on this, since it is a key component of the application. What if my supervisor or fill in the blank person says no? And this happens every so often. I think it is something to keep in mind, that it certainly could happen, and that there are a variety of reasons why it could happen. For some supervisors, maybe are a little bit newer and more junior in their career, and they don't feel comfortable because they understand the magnitude of this. If you get a no, the first thing I would ask is why. And certainly do a little bit of, try to understand sort of the reason behind it. And if it's maybe something that you can work through together, that could certainly be an option. But if you do get a hard no, then everything that I said earlier about other alternates certainly would apply here. And so it is important, again, to think about who else could you potentially ask, either within your organization, an indirect manager, or potentially even maybe a mentor or advisor would be another great person. But if your direct supervisor or if someone says no, it is important to make sure that you do obviously respect that, though, and then think about alternatives. And then lastly, what if you can't decide between writers? So for a lot of folks, they build this matrix and they realize that there are 3, 4, 5 people who can sort of speak to many different things. What I encourage you to do then is, number one, see if any of the schools will take additional supplemental letters. Some programs will take a 3rd or 4th letter. Obviously, if a school says 2, then stick to 2. But there are opportunities potentially for someone to be able to submit an extra letter. But if you really kind of get down to it, start actually bulleting out or sort of framing out some of the examples. And this gives you a good sense to be able to sort of zoom out and take a look at what's the quality behind the stories that ideally you would want these folks to tell. And again, none of this is an absolute, but it does give you a chance then to sort of get into the driver's seat and at least think about, if I was the architect of this, what are the stories that I want an admissions committee reading about me? And then weigh your options that way, and then approach the folks about your letters. All right, so let's talk a little bit about do's and don'ts here, and then we'll start wrapping up. And before we head over to Q&A, and I see the chat has exploded, so it looks like we do have a lot of questions. So just sort of summarizing here, when it comes to letters of rec, do make sure at the beginning, before you ask anyone, that you inventory all of your experiences, learnings, and skills. So this actually sort of predates even the matrix that we're talking about. Before you really start doing anything, take the time to update your resume. Take a look at what are all of the business, the professional and the personal experiences that you've had. What are the things that are going to be really important for you to highlight in various parts of your application, and which are the things that are better reserved for a letter of rec or potentially for an interview. The clients I work with, oftentimes we talk about sort of a parking lot. And so if there's material that you really feel strongly would be important, but it can't fit necessarily into an essay, we stick it in the parking lot, and then we go back and we figure out, could it align potentially with a letter of rec? Is this something we try to save for the interview? But where are the other places in your application to talk about it? So it's important, first off, I think, to do that inventory. And again, don't forget skills as well. Skills are just as important as the professional experience. Next up, make sure that you are building that matrix. So capture skills, and certainly don't feel like you need to be limited to what is listed on the HBS or on the Common Letter of Rec template. Include other unique skills that you feel that you have developed and nurtured over throughout your professional career. Because again, the purpose of the Letter of Rec is to make sure that you're highlighting different skills and traits that are going to be valuable to the school. Again, as I mentioned a couple of times now, make sure that you're giving folks sufficient time to prepare and to write those letters. Please do not be asking them, with just a couple of weeks to put together something meaningful, because chances are you're not going to get the quality that you're hoping for. And then last but not least, just make sure that this is an open dialogue and conversation. So making sure that those letter writers have that guidance, have specific examples. Don't be afraid to offer to meet with them, to talk through it as well. I think that many folks think that they don't want to be perceived as micromanaging the process. And so I think it's really important to make sure that, again, to have an open and honest communication with the folks writing your letter, so that way you can be really candid about the things that you're thinking about. You can certainly go to them with multiple options. But I find that more often than not, if you have that conversation with them ahead of time and you can give them guidance that is much more concise and much more organized, but no, work for your are Hello, everyone. I'm not quite sure where I lost you all, but Target Test Prep's Zoom seems to have booted me out, so I apologize for that. Let me get the screen back up. Give me just one moment. So I'm not sure where I lost you, to be quite frank, but I think it was somewhere around getting redundant letters. And so all I will just say there is that, again, I think in that vein, just make sure that you're not asking folks to talk about the same things. You've got limited real estate in your application. And so it is really important to make sure that you have folks talking about different skills, different experiences, and really sort of being able to paint as broad and diverse of a picture as possible. As we talked about, make sure that you are not writing the letter yourself. And then also in that same vein, make sure that you're not asking to review the letter. It is really important that you are sort of showing that trust with someone, that you feel good about what they're going to submit. Many folks will oftentimes ask folks if they want to read it, and that is up to you. But I always encourage folks, do not ask directly to review the letter. And then last but not least, please don't forget to send a thank you note or a small token of appreciation. You're asking folks to do quite a bit of heavy lifting. And so it is really important to make sure that they understand that you are incredibly appreciative of this, and that, that this is sort of something that rolls up and really is a big piece of your application. So as I had mentioned at the beginning, TTP does offer a variety of different admissions consulting services. School packages and hourly are probably our most two popular services or sort of channels that we offer. And then as you can see here, the a la carte services. So everything from application review to mock interview preparation, resume review, things like that are all things that we can certainly help the clients work on as you prepare either for round one or round two. What I would say letters of recommendation roll up into the school package. So the school packages really focus on helping clients with every aspect of the application, from school engagement, school selection, brand building, essay brainstorming, letters of rec, interview prep, you name it. And so that's sort of where the letter of rec conversations typically roll up in the school package. And then with that, that takes us to the end here. And so let me go into now the chat, and hopefully all the questions have saved and we can go in and start answering a couple of questions. We've got just about 10 minutes left. So thank you again for your patience there. All right, let's see here. So we have a couple of questions about clarifying sort of the differences between GMAT focus and GMAT, and then sort of preference around GMAT as well. So the comment wasn't that GMAT focus had been dropped. It was that GMAT focus. So for the GMAT exam changed, as most of you know, and it was called GMAT focus. The new version of the GMAT was called GMAT focus. GMAT dropped the name focus from the assessment on July 1st. So now there's just one version of the exam. It's going back to be referred to as just the GMAT itself. And so that was the comments there around sort of GMAT as opposed to GMAT focus. So because for a while there were two versions of the exam that did exist, and then for a while GMAT focus has been the only one since the beginning of the year. And so this really just indicates and is sort of more of a signal to everyone that there is just one version of the GMAT, and that is the GMAT itself. And as I mentioned, that went into effect yesterday. We had some questions about sort of GMAT versus GRE and which one is preferred. And so, there are many schools most programs these days will accept either the GMAT or the GRE. And what I would recommend to you is that if you are early in the process and you're not sure which one to do, which one would be a better fit for you, I recommend that you actually take a diagnostic for both and see how you score. They are very different exams and assessments. As someone who's taken both and has written course material for both of these tests over the years, I can tell you as a matter of fact, they are very, very different tests. If you are a little bit shakier on quant, I usually tend, or maybe a little less certain about your quant skills, I usually tend to recommend to folks that they maybe take a second look at the GRE. The GRE quant tends to be a bit easier to navigate for many folks. But most schools are not going to have a preference. If they do, they will certainly tell you on the website or in an info session. But by and large, more schools are looking at both exams equally these days. A question about how beneficial letters of rec are from extracurriculars. So I think it's a great question. I think a lot of it depends, number one, on the type of work that you're doing as the extracurricular activity. If you are working very, very closely and working significant hours or putting in significant hours and time and energy into a volunteer activity or into an extracurricular, and more importantly, someone at that nonprofit or organization is able to really speak to, again, everything that we just talked about. So those technical skills, those soft skills, it's perfectly appropriate to have someone write a letter of rec. Again, I think the primary focus, though, that first letter ideally should be from someone either at your current company or at a recent company, because again, that professional experience that you've built and developed over throughout your professional career is really going to be what you're trying to have the school sort of understand a bit better. See, so we had some questions about sort of sharing examples of the matrices. So I'll be honest, I do not have an example of the matrix itself. I think I described it fairly well. It is something certainly, what I would encourage you to do is feel free to go to Target Test Prep's website. You can absolutely sign up for a free consultation, send over a copy of your resume, and we'll spend 15, 20 minutes kind of talking a little bit about your business school plans. If you have specific questions about letters of rec or the matrix, I'm happy to certainly walk you through that during the consultation. And certainly, obviously, that's something that I work really closely with my clients on as well. Questions about letters of rec from former managers. So yes, as I had mentioned before, if you have former supervisors or managers who know you very well, and I would say if it's a reasonably recent experience, and so I think anything that probably goes beyond 3, 4, 5 years, is probably going to be a little bit tougher, because chances are you've probably grown or advanced in your career significantly, and you're probably very different now than you were when you worked at that organization. But again, I encourage folks, it really is about the quality of the relationship, the quality of the experiences that you were able to build. And I would also say probably is more importantly, if it's someone that you kept in touch with, who has been tracking your career, maybe mentoring you or advising you in some way, obviously that factors into it as well, because they're going to have more to say about you. Let's see here. How many letters of rec should you have? So most schools are going to require 2. Some schools, as I mentioned, will oftentimes take an additional supplement or supplemental letter of rec. I would say it's good to have, at least 2 folks, but potentially maybe a third as a, sort of either as a backup or as a supplement as you think about it. And then a great question here about what about schools that only take 1 letter of recommendation? What I would do in that case is, I think ideally you would want to have someone who you've worked with more recently, or with whom you work currently. But again, I think the bottom line here is, though, and I've said this a couple of times, but I'll be honest, I don't think I can say it enough, is it's the quality of that relationship. Think about the stories that someone is going to be able to tell in that letter of rec, and make sure that you're picking the person who's going to be able to write the most detailed, or tell the better and the best stories really about you and the impact you've been able to have. Let's see here. Questions. Let's see. We have a couple of questions about recommender writing styles. So the writing style per se doesn't matter necessarily. I do think that this is an area where if you do have, if you are coming maybe from an industry that is a little bit less traditional, and what I mean by that is, if you're coming from an industry maybe where you don't have as many people typically pursuing MBAs, where you have folks who are not writing as many letters of recommendation, I think this is where that conversation can be incredibly important, and that guidance is really important. And so if you can provide your letter writer, again, with sort of that document that gives them a framework for the things that you would, like them to highlight or like them to touch on in the letter, that is going to absolutely be to your benefit. And so I would definitely encourage you to think about, spend the time, like invest the time and energy, number one, into building those documents, that guidance for your letter writers, and then spend the time sitting down with a person and making sure that it is very, very clear. A couple of questions here about timeline. I would say 4 to 5 weeks. A lot of this is going to say it depends on sort of the industry. I usually encourage clients that I work with to at least make the ask anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks out. And the reason for that is, depending on the industry that you work on, and when you are applying and what those deadlines are, 4 to 5 weeks may not be enough. If you're going into, if the deadline falls around potentially a very busy season in your industry. And so I do think that it is important to make sure that you give them ample time, at least if for no other reason than to at least just get the yes, so you can plan around that for the rest of your application as well. A question about, this is a great question. Is it okay to have 2 separate letters of recommendation from two people, within the same company? And what I would say here is, the short answer is it depends. Again, I would go back to that matrix that you build and think about what are the things that you're going to have these individuals talk about. If you've worked, particularly if you come from an industry, for example, maybe like consulting, where if you've worked on 2 very different projects, if you've worked maybe on a client project that came from one industry and another one where you played a very, very different role, chances are people are going to have very different things to say about you. And that could be a great opportunity, again, to highlight very different and diverse skill sets and experiences that you've had. And so in that case, it certainly could be valuable. Again, I would really take the time to think about, sort of what are those experiences, what are those skills, and again, what are those folks at the end of the day going to actually say in the letters, and think about how that sort of ladders up. But it absolutely is fair game and appropriate, especially if you've been able to work very deeply with someone, but maybe in a couple of different in different capacities. Let's see, some questions here about letters of rec. And with regards to extracurriculars here as well. So some of the things about extracurriculars and letters, so as I mentioned before, I think if you have very deep experience and if you can sort of apply that litmus test of business skills to that, it certainly is appropriate. But there are some questions that it looks like have come in about sort of newer activities and sort of length of time doing the extracurricular. And so again, I think that the litmus test here is if you have someone who can, again, speak to skills and experiences and more importantly, impact and results that you've been able to drive, that's going to be, again, I think that's going to really be the driver there. Let's see here. Oh, we have a couple questions about military. This is one of my, not that I don't love every population, but this is one of my favorite populations to work with. Say military spouse here, 20 years and counting. So yes, very soft spot for military. So guidance around recommenders in the military. I think this is incredibly, this is a great question because you do have, especially within the military, you have folks who are providing essentially letters of rec or validation every time, essentially every time you go up for a promotion. What I would suggest though, if you are either active duty or a military veteran and you're asking for a letter of rec from someone in the military, the way of writing a letter of rec coming from the military is going to be very different than writing a letter of rec sort of in the civilian world or for business school. And so again, all those same rules and that guidance applies. It is really, really important to make sure that you give them that guidance. But more importantly, and probably specifically for military, it's really important that you also help them translate a lot of what you've done in the military into civilian speak or into vernacular jargon or business jargon even. So that way it does land well with the person reading. You can't assume that they're going to have someone on staff who does have military experience who will be able to decipher some of that. So really trying to coach them through how do you make sure that what they're talking about is really relatable and resonates with a civilian is going to be most helpful there. Let's see here. Some questions about round 1 versus round 2. Let's see here. So for a lot of schools like Harvard, for example, they take the same number of folks round 1 versus round 2, so it doesn't necessarily matter. But for many schools, I think I would say in some ways there is a little bit of a first mover's advantage. If folks want to be some of the first folks in front of admissions committees. And so I think that if you are able to put together a very compelling and complete application package, try to apply in the earlier rounds. But also know if you are looking at very competitive programs that the margin of error is very, very slim when you start looking across programs. And so it is important that the package you're putting out there is going to be represents the very best version of yourself. And so if the question is, do I apply with sort of a 50% solution versus wait around and apply with something that's like a 90% solution, hands down, I will always tell you apply in a later round with the more complete package. See, it looks like we've got time. It's at the top of the hour. We've got time for maybe one more question. It looks like we have some questions from international folks who haven't been able to necessarily work, off campus or in the corporate world. And so in that case, again, I think the rules then would apply there are if you have been able to work on campus, whether it's TAing or doing maybe through like a work study type program, that certainly is fair game. In that case, also maybe an academic recommendation is going to be more appropriate. And so I would encourage you to think a little bit more about other folks within your university ecosystem who you could ask as well, who are going to, again, anyone who's going to be able to speak to those skills. All right, with that, I think we do have to wrap up. So I will say again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Joanna. If you'd like to sign up for a free consultation, please feel free to visit targettestprep.com. You can navigate to MBA Admissions Consulting and request a free consultation there, and we can chat a little bit more about your background and how how I might be able to help further. But thank you so much for joining today, and it was a pleasure to spend some time with you all. And best of luck to everyone with their applications this cycle. Thank you so much. Take care.